Greetings to everyone. We are going to learn about the modern period. Modern period in the English literature begins with the 20th century and remained till 1965. The period saw an abrupt breakaway from the old ways of interacting with the world. In all the previous period, experimentation and individualism were highly discouraged. But with the onset of modern period, both these things become virtues. There were many cultural shocks with the beginning of modernism. The blow of modern age were the World War One and Two. The first of the 20th century, from 1900 to 1950, can best be described as the time of change. People who were once ruled by kings were suddenly given new governments, and people who once could not vote suddenly could. The following is a list of the 10 most important events of 1900 to 1950, and we are going to learn how they impacted literature. This concept became one that our world had already been introduced, especially in 1900. More and more factories pop up in cities, and more people begin working for them. This was the main reason for making a change in literature. While this was an art movement in Europe, Cubism also highly affected literature and the world. People began seeing the world in a new way. Cubism pieces and all cultural pieces, including literature and the music, highly show how the world was thinking differently and changing. The White Peacock by D.H. Lawrence is a best example for Cubism literature. By 1914, the First World War had broken out. The world was in mourning of its losses and anger against its enemies. Literature highly changed during this time, and the trench poets began emerging. One of the most regarded and remembered trench poem is Flender Field by John Macker. Women's rights were discussed in the modern period. This led to the women's right movement. All over the world, women began fighting for the right to vote. The date women received the vote is different in many countries, but in Canada, 1919 was the year all women received the vote except for Quebec. Who received this vote in 1940? Female authors like Neil McClung not only championed for the effort, but also had their ideas reflect in their writing. New political parties was the main reason for in the modern period, and it impacted a lot in literature. During the early 1900s, the form of government kept in place for years were being changed. In Russia, the Russian revolutions occurred and the Bolshevik party came into power. This change shocked the democratic world and would become much more important in later years. In Italy and Germany, both countries suddenly had dictators. That was the big change in the change in literature. Writers like Huck Macklin and George Orwell show the viewing on these issues in the writing. Great Depression was also one of the main important factor impacted the literature. On October 29th, 1929, the Wall Street market crashed. Many people lost jobs and many dreamed of going to new places for new things. John Steinbeck wrote about doing so in The Grapes of Wrath. After the celebration of World War One, prohibition, the banning of alcohol came into play. Yet, despite this, people began to party more and even drink more during the Roaring Twenties. F. Fitzgerald books like The Great Gatsby capitalize on this theme. Spanish Civil War was also the main reason, and it impacted a lot in modern period. Many countries were dealing with political changes. Many countries were also facing civil war. Spain was one of them, and this war was not captured in literature better than in Ernest Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls. World War II, it was also the important reason, and it impacted a lot in literature. Because of Hitler's unethical and immoral ways, the world went to a war for second time in 1939. Just like in the First World War, authors were influenced. Writers like A.M. Klein again were influenced. He wrote about anti Semitism in his poem Autobiographical. In the modern period is also considered as a nuclear age. Just before the Second World War fully come into a close in the summer of 1945, the American bombed Nagasaki and Hiroshima with nuclear atom bombs. The devastation was horrifying. Many books to follow centered on nuclear holocaust, including George Orwell's 1984. Arising out of the rebellious mood at the beginning of 20th century, modernism was a radical approach that aimed to revitalize the way modern civilization viewed life, art, politics, and science. This attitude that flourished between 1900 and to 1930 had as its basis the rejection of European culture for having become too corrupt, complacent, and lethargic, ailing because it was bound by artificialities of a society that was too preoccupied with image and too scared of change. For the establishment, the result would be cataclysmic. The new emerging culture would undermine tradition and authority in the hopes of transforming contemporary society. The first characteristic associated with modernism is nihilism, the rejection of all religious and moral principles as the only means of obtaining social progress. Modernist Modernists did not follow the moral code of the society in which they were living in. The reason that they did was not necessarily because they did not believe in God, although there was a great majority of them who were atheists and that they experienced great doubt about the meaninglessness of life. In other words, the rules of conduct were a restrictive and a limiting force over a human spirit. The modernist believed that for an individual to feel whole and a contributor to the revitalization of social progress, he or she needed to be free of all the encumbering package of 100 years of hypocrisy. The rejection of moral and religious principle was compounded by the repudiation of all system of belief, whether in the arts, politics, sciences, and philosophy. With so many scientific discoveries and the technological innovation taking place, the world was changing so quickly that culture had to redefine itself constantly in order to keep pace with the modernity and not appear anachronistic. By the time a new scientific or philosophical system or artistic style had found acceptance. Another reason of this fickleness was the fact that people felt a tremendous creative energy always looming in the background, as if the announce of birth of some new invention or theory. As a consequence of new technological dynamic, the modernists felt a sense of constant anticipations and they did not want to commit to any one system that would thereby harness creativity, ultimately restricting and annihilating it. And so, in the arts, for instance, at the beginning of the 20th century, they questioned academic art for its lack of freedom and flirted with so many isms. Sexism, faunism, expressionism, cubism, futurism, conservatism, Dada, and surrealism. Pablo Picasso, for instance, went as far as experimenting with several of these styles, never wanting to feel too comfortable with any one style. This wrestling with all new assumption about reality and the culture generated a new permissiveness in the realm of the arts. The arts were now beginning to break all the rules since they were trying to keep pace with all these theoretical and technological advances that were changing the whole structure of life. Languages that could more appropriately express the meaning of all of the new changes that were occurring. The result was a new art that appeared strange and radical to whoever experienced it because the artistic standard had always been mimesis. The literal imitations or representation of the appearance of nature, people, and society. In other words, art was supposed to be judged on the standard of how well it realistically reflected what something looked and sounded like. In the year 1900, ushered the new era that changed the way that reality was perceived and portrayed. Years later, this revolutionary new period would come to be known as modernism and would forever be defined as a time when artist and thinker rebelled against every conceivable doctrine that was widely accepted by the establishment, whether in the arts, science, medicine, philosophy, etc. Although modernism would be the short-lived from 1900 to 1930, we are still reeling from its influences 65 years later. How was modernism such a radical departure from what had preceded it in the past? The modernists were militant about distancing themselves from every traditional idea that had been held sacred by Western civilization, and perhaps we can even go so far as to refer to them as intellectual anarchists in their willingness to vandalize anything connected to the established order. In order to better understand this modernist iconoclasm, let's go back in time to explore how and why the human landscape was changing so rapidly. Modernity, however, was not only shaped by this new technology. Several philosophical theoreticians were to change the way that modern man perceives the external world. The first to do so was F.S. Bradley, who considered that the human mind is a more fundamental feature of universe than matter and that its purpose is to search for truth. His most ambitious work, Appearance and Reality, a metaphysical essay, introduced the concept that an object in reality can have no absolute contour, but varies from the angle from which it is seen. Bradley defines the identity of a thing as the view the onlooker takes of it. The effect of the work was to encourage rather than dispel doubt. In one of the most seminal work of this century on the electrodynamic of moving bodies, Albert Einstein's theory of relativity held that for all the frames of references, the speed of light is constant, and if all natural laws are the same, then both time and motion are found to be relative to the observer. In other words, there is no such thing as universal time, and thus experience runs very differently from man to man. Alfred Whitehead was another who revised the ideas of time, space, and motion as the basis of man's perception of the external world. He viewed reality as living geometry and believed in the essential relevance of every object to all other objects. All entities or factors in the universe are essentially relevant to each other's existence, since every entity involves an indefinite array of perceptives. For all of this thinker, subjectivity was now the main focus. Several psychological theoreticians were to fundamentally alter the way that modern man viewed his own internal reality and unexplored heart of darkness. Sigmund Freud was the first to gasp inwardly and to discover the world within where dynamic, often varying forces shape the individual's physique and personality. To explain this internal world within each of us, he developed a complex theory of the unconscious that illustrated the importance of unconscious motivation in behavior and the proportion that psychological events can go on outside of the conscious awareness. Freud expanded man's definition of sexuality to include oral, anal, and other bodily sensations. Thus, his legacy to the modern world was to expose a darker side of man that had been hidden from view by the hypocrisy of 19th century society. Freud was not the only psychological theoretician who asked us to gasp inwardly to better understand the human physique. His disciple Carl Jung was also to develop another theory delving into the unconscious, which explored the nature of the irrational self and which explained the common ground shared by so many cultures. Jung's theory of the collective unconscious about an area of mind that he believed was shared by everyone stated that there are patterns of behavior or action and the reaction of physics which he calls archetypes that are determined by race. These patterns manifest themselves in dreams, visions, and fantasies, and are expressed in myth, religious concept, fairy tales, and work of art. Politics and the economy would also transform the way that modern man look at himself and the world in which he lived. Science and technology radically changing the means of production, whereas in the past a worker became involved in production from beginning to end. By 1900, he had become a mere cog in the production line, making an insignificant contribution. Division of labor made him feel fragmented, alienated, not only from the rest of the society but from himself. One of the effect of this fragmentation was the consolidation of workers into political parties that threatened the upper classes, and thus the new political idealism that was culminated in Russian revolutions that swept through Europe. Finally, as in a summary, the modern age began as the time of new ideas, hope, creativity, and curiosity. Then it became fearful, violent, and hardworking. Pride and fun suddenly became was quickly replaced by struggle again fear. Fear became seen throughout the rest of those 50 years. The modern age began with high hope but ended with the seemingly crushed dreams. To conclude everything in short, I would say there are many more things which you should know about the modern period and literature development of this era. The more you will study the works of modernist literature, the more you will admire it. There are some literary theories or concepts which you may not understand easily. So, it is a summary we can learn from this topic. Thank you.